Earlier this year, the 2024 NASCAR Cup Series schedule was finally released. Apparently, the last major hangup was a planned race in Canada that was on again and off again before it finally fell through. But rumor has it it's still in the works for 2025. For the first time since 1953, the NASCAR Cup Series will return to the state of Iowa, as the Iowa Speedway will open its doors for the highest level of stock car racing in the country. This is also the first time a new short track has been added to the schedule for a points-paying race since 1970, when the Albany-Saratoga Speedway was added to the lineup. Oddly enough, it was also in 1970 when the Cup Series held its last race on a dirt track, until the Bristol Dirt Race was added in 2021. But as I glanced through the 2024 schedule, I noticed the Bristol Dirt Race was not going to return, and dirt racing in the biggest American motorsport would go on hiatus once again. The reason? Well, two things. First, covering a half-mile track in dirt once a year cannot be cheap. And while the crowd sizes were noticeably larger for the dirt races than the last few spring races on concrete, spending weeks trucking in dirt and then sending in a grading team was eating into whatever profits the track was seeing. And the second reason was, it was what the fans wanted. People loudly said they missed the spring daytime race and wanted it to return, even though the attendance was piss poor for the last few years of its tenure. We'll see if people put their money where their mouth is on March 17th of next year. But I think dirt racing should remain in NASCAR in some capacity, in every division if at all possible. And there are plenty of good reasons for it to stick around. It's not just for novelty's sake. Racing on dirt is a unique skill that thousands of people all across America try their hand at mastering every Friday or Saturday night at their local short track. It's all about finesse and sawing at the wheel with minute little adjustments that seem so minor to the average person like me that they seem almost unnecessary. But that driver is doing a dance with an 800+ horsepower monster while looking for whatever grip he can find out on the clay. It is a class act in throttle control and precise, damn near perfect steering. When Richard Childress' two grandsons, Ty and Austin, wanted to begin their racing careers, Richard sent them to dirt tracks all over the Carolinas to start off. His reasoning was that learning the fundamentals about racing is better done in the toughest circumstances. The fiercest fires produce the hardest steel. And yeah, I know people like to clown on the Dillon brothers from time to time, myself included, but Richard's approach seems to have worked. Those guys have wins and championships to show for it. Yeah, their grandfather was one of the biggest NASCAR team owners in the sport, and they had a big leg up in the connections department, but they are still miles better at racing than me or you or just about anybody else watching this video right now. And if I were to win the lottery and decide to take up auto racing, I think I'd throw myself into the dirt scene first to get to know the basics of car control as quickly as possible. Kyle Larson is one of the best drivers in the business right now, an absolute phenom, a generational talent. Tony Stewart described him as a plug-and-play driver that can just be dropped into almost anything and immediately go fast. And Larson got that way by racing on dirt his whole life. Larson can get the most out of his equipment because that's just the world he comes from. Dirt racing produces some of the best talent in all of motorsports, but that's all for naught if nobody shows up to the races to watch. Fans are the backbone of any sport. Without them, making a living being a race car driver would be impossible. But thankfully, dirt track fans are some of the most loyal fans any sport could ever hope for. No matter if it's the King's Royal at Eldora or some random Saturday night feature at Lawrence County Speedway, these people show up and show out. I mean, they're right up there with WWE fans in terms of loyalty and putting their money where their mouth is. As NASCAR has waned in popularity over the years, maybe tapping into a thriving scene that they were once a part of could be a nice shot in the arm. NASCAR started on dirt, and it made up a majority of the schedule well into the 1960s. For all the talk of returning to our roots, this opportunity to return to the dirt that built the sport always gets overlooked. Plus, having dirt racers like Jonathan Davenport and Stuart Friesen, guys who would normally never even be thought of for a Cup Series start, get an opportunity to race on the biggest stage as a dirt ringer would make for some eye-catching headlines and reel in some of those dirt track fanatics. However, despite this looking like a no-brainer, there are a litany of problems that I think will most likely prevent the Cup Series from going back to dirt for a long time. The first is the problem myself and many others have pointed out. Hey, we like the idea of dirt racing, but just go to an actual dirt track. Not one of our better paved short tracks that we just threw some mud on. If you're going to do this, then do it right and go to a venue made for dirt racing that can be ran and maintained by dirt people who know what they're doing. Because building a dirt track is a lot more complex than just slinging some mud all over the place in a circle. Making a good dirt surface and with the right banking in the right places is a lot like baking a cake. Too much of any one thing here or there and the whole thing just turns out wrong. Just one problem with going to a purpose-built dirt track though. Where on earth is there a ready-to-go dirt track big enough to host a NASCAR Cup Series race? Well, there's really just two practical options, Eldora and Knoxville. But both are on the smaller side, with Knoxville boasting a capacity of a little more than 20,000 seats if you pack the fans in like sardines. and Eldora having a record attendance of 25,000 set back in 2017 for their World 100 late model event. But oh well, we can expand these venues if we need to, right? Eldora maybe, it's out in farmland, but Knoxville, hell no. Just look where it is, surrounded by city streets right in the middle of downtown Knoxville, Iowa. There is nowhere to expand. The Knoxville Nationals already bring that town to a standstill. Do you really think the locals are going to be crazy about NASCAR doing that to them for another weekend out of the year? And yeah, Knoxville Raceway is in Knoxville, Iowa, not Knoxville, Tennessee. The Cup Series is already going to Iowa Speedway in Newton for 2024, and that's just 35 minutes up the road. We could alternate like I suggested in my 2021 schedule realignment video, have Iowa Speedway run in even-numbered years and do Knoxville in odd-numbered years, but even then I'm not totally sold on it because the Truck Series already tried out Knoxville Raceway twice. The 2022 race was just kind of alright, but the 2021 event was a shit show. Despite being just a scheduled 150-lap event, there were 14 cautions and an additional 29 laps run for the multiple green-white checkered attempts. 44% of the race was run under yellow with an average race speed of 36.8 miles per hour, making it the slowest race of NASCAR's modern era. I think the complete lack of respect in the lower divisions is the bigger culprit, but Knoxville being relatively flat with just a single groove definitely contributed. That leaves Eldora as the last remaining option for a purpose-built dirt track. All other venues are just too small unless NASCAR wants to dump tens of millions of dollars into an upgrade package for a little pet project. But that seems completely impractical, especially considering the spiraling costs for NASCAR Cup teams these days. How many of these dirt races do we want to run per year anyway? 1 or maybe 2 at most? Are we really talking about teams keeping a dirt car on hand in the fleet for 1 race per year? Hell, this was even a problem back in 1970 when NASCAR ran its last few dirt races. Richard Petty, who won that last dirt race at the North Carolina Fairgrounds, didn't even own a dirt car anymore. He borrowed the car he raced in that event from somebody else, on the agreement that he'd soup it up and give it back to the owner with the upgrades included. And if Petty Enterprises, the richest and most successful team in NASCAR, couldn't find room in their fleet for a dirt car in 1970, then why should teams today? Back in the Gen 6 days, it probably wouldn't have mattered as much as the Gen 6 car was basically a reskinned car of tomorrow. And those chassis have been manufactured from 2007 all the way through 2021. There were tons of them laying around, which is why ARCA teams could buy them up and run their 2 dirt races a year with no issues despite having much smaller budgets. But the next gen Cup car is expensive, like $300K upfront bare minimum. It's almost 3 times more expensive than an old Gen 6 car. Compounding the problem is NASCAR implemented a new rule saying that teams could now only keep 7 chassis on hand at a time instead of an unlimited amount. So that means you could probably have 2 short track cars, since we're doing 8 short track races a year if you include the Clash at the Coliseum and the All-Star race at North Wilkesboro, a road course car, 2 intermediate cars since those tracks make up the bulk of the schedule, and 2 super speedway cars because, let's face it, you're going to total at least one of those things per year. Where are you supposed to fit a dirt car into all of this? You don't. At a time when we're supposed to be capping costs, going to Eldora is a massive waste of money for these teams. I could say the same about Atlanta now that it's a super speedway, but I digress. But probably one of the biggest problems we face with this dirt track idea is a lack of horsepower. NASCAR has made it abundantly clear that they're not trying to increase horsepower for short tracks and the like. I know Steve Phelps has dozens of in-house experts on this issue, and they've all been begging for more horsepower over the years, but he doesn't seem to think that's going to solve things, so that's that. But when it comes to dirt racing, horsepower is the very thing that makes it so fun. You have a surface that is loose and almost fluid, and having 900 horsepower at the pedal is a lot to keep in check. But right now, Cup cars produce about 670 horsepower, and that's just not enough to make a dirt track race exciting with how big and heavy these things are. Little Timmy's uncle down at Cherokee Speedway in Gaffney, South Carolina runs a late model that has more power than that. You can't go full send and sling a race car around the clay and put on a good show with that little amount of power under the hood. And the next gen car isn't getting any more power anytime soon, it sounds like, despite the fact that the Cup cars are basically running the same engine they were back in 2014. Back then they were hitting 900 horsepower out on the track. Since 2015 they put in a tapered spacer to cut them down to 750 horsepower, and they've been chopping it down ever since. I know horsepower costs money, but we've already got the engines. They've essentially been built the same way for over a decade. Just take off the restrictors. But the powers that be said they're not going to do that. The cost for this type of racing once or twice a year just isn't worth it. And even if those 2 things weren't issues, where are we even going to host the damn thing? Look, I love a good dirt race. I've been to more dirt races this year thanks to my short track tour than I have in my entire life before 2023. And I've become a big fan of that type of racing. But but I just don't see a dirt race in the cards for the Cup Series anytime soon. There's just too many things in the way. However, for the lower divisions, most of these problems don't even exist. Their cars are comparatively cheap, they've got plenty of them on hand, smaller venues aren't a problem, and the lack of horsepower can be subverted by just having the right talent out there. The SRX Series races on dirt proves just about every single one of these points. So, while we may never see next gens caked with dirt and clay again, the sky's the limit for everybody else. But let me know what you think. Can this era of Cup cars ever return to dirt track racing, or is this all just some pipe dream? Anyway, I'm Slapshoes, thanks for watching, and until next time, y'all take it easy.